The afternoon sun beat down on the wooden platform of Sagebrush Crossing, painting long, dusty shadows over the cracked boards. Clara Whitmore stepped off the train, clutching a worn carpet bag to her chest as if it were a shield. The air smelled of dry earth, horse sweat, and faraway pines. Her heart hammered in her chest, not from the heat, but from fear. She had come west to start over. To cook, to clean, to earn her keep, nothing more. Back home in Missouri, she'd been the girl no man noticed twice. Her aunt had once told her, "You're a good soul, Clara, but plain as a fence post," and those words had stuck like burrs. So when she'd read the newspaper ad, ranch cook needed, room and board included, must be honest and hard-working, she'd whispered a prayer and sent a letter. Now she stood alone, waiting for the man who had written back, Elias Kane, owner of Silver Creek Ranch. She smoothed her faded dress and adjusted her bonnet so low that only her chin showed. People bustled around her, freight workers, ranch hands, a woman in a red hat laughing too loudly, but no one spoke to her. Clara kept her eyes on her boots, afraid of catching anyone's gaze. She didn't want pity nor curiosity. A tall shadow fell across her. She looked up and saw a man approaching, broad-shouldered, sunburned, his hat pulled low, his eyes the color of the creek stones she used to skip as a child. There was a stillness about him, the kind that came from years of open land and long silences. "You, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Yes, sir," she said, almost whispering. "You must be Mr. Kane," he nodded once. "Elias'll do." He took her bag before she could protest and gestured toward a waiting wagon. "Long ride ahead. Hope you don't mind dust." "I'm used to it," she murmured, climbing up beside him. Her hands fidgeted in her lap the whole way. The road wound through miles of golden grass, broken only by fences and windmills. Clara stole glances at her new employer when she thought he wasn't looking. His jaw was set in that quiet way of men who'd seen too much and said too little. There was a silver band of worn leather around his wrist, a reminder perhaps of someone he'd lost. "You ever worked a ranch kitchen before?" he asked after a while. "No, sir. But I can cook well enough, and I don't waste food. I know how to stretch what's given." He gave a small, approving grunt. "That'll do." The rest of the ride passed mostly in silence, save for the creak of the wagon and the cry of hawks overhead. But the silence didn't feel cruel. It felt steady, like the earth itself was listening. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had settled over the valley. The main house stood strong and weathered, its porch light flickering like a small beacon. Clara's chest tightened. It wasn't just a building, it was a chance. A fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could belong somewhere again. Elias helped her down from the wagon, his rough hand surprisingly gentle. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. She ducked her head, hiding her blush behind her bonnet. "Thank you, sir." As he turned to unhitch the horses, Clara looked up for a brief moment. The sky blazed with the last light of the sun, and in that glow, she allowed herself a single thought she hadn't dared for years. Maybe life still had room for someone like her. She didn't know then that the man beside her, the one who spoke little and saw much, had already noticed her honesty in the way she held herself, and that one day he'd tell her something she'd never believed possible, that truth and kindness could shine brighter than beauty ever would. The Silver Creek ranch was quiet, too quiet for Clara's liking. The first morning she woke there, sunlight filtered weakly through the lace curtains, cutting across the empty dining table. The house felt like a place that had once been full of life but had long since stopped breathing. She dressed quickly, tying her apron around her waist, and stepped into the kitchen. The smell of dust mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke and old coffee. Someone had cooked here once, a woman, she guessed. Everything had its place, but time had left its mark. The worn handles on the cupboards, the faded curtains, the rocking chair in the corner that looked as though it still waited for someone to return. Outside, she could hear the ranch hands starting their day. Hooves thudded against the earth. Men called to one another, and somewhere in the distance, Elias's deep voice carried a command. It was a sound that made her heart flutter and settle at the same time. Clara filled the stove with wood and began cooking. Her hands worked quickly, more from habit than confidence. She fried eggs, baked biscuits, and stirred gravy, trying to keep herself busy enough to forget how alone she felt. By the time the men came in for breakfast, The air was thick with the smell of butter and coffee. They filed in, tipping hats, offering polite nods. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," one of them said kindly. "Smells mighty fine," she smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir. Hope it tastes as good as it smells." They laughed lightly, but when Elias entered, the room went still. He didn't need to speak to command respect. He sat at the head of the table, nodded his thanks, and began to eat. Clara stood back, watching from the kitchen door. She couldn't help noticing how the men looked to him before they said anything, how even silence seemed to follow his lead. After breakfast, the house emptied again, leaving her with nothing but the echo of boots and the clatter of dishes. She moved through the rooms as quietly as she could, dusting, scrubbing, polishing surfaces that hadn't been touched in months. The house spoke of loss in every creak of its floorboards. A framed photograph of a smiling woman and two small children sat on the mantel, Elias's wife and sons, she supposed. Her chest ached at the sight. By mid-afternoon, the loneliness pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. She found herself standing before the cracked mirror in her small room. Her reflection stared back, pale face, freckled nose, hair pulled too tight. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing here, Clara Whitmore?" she whispered. "This house doesn't need you." "No one does." She turned away quickly, ashamed of her own tears. But the ache wouldn't go away. The laughter she'd heard from the bunkhouse earlier drifted back to her mind, rough, carefree voices. She imagined them talking about her, the quiet, plain girl who didn't belong among them. When evening came, she lit a lamp and sat by the window, mending shirts by hand. The steady rhythm of the needle calmed her. Outside, she saw Elias walking across the yard, his long stride steady, his face unreadable. He paused by the porch steps and looked toward her window. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Clara's breath caught, and she quickly turned away, pretending to focus on her stitching. But she felt his gaze linger, a quiet, thoughtful kind of look, not judging, not pitying, just seeing. Still, as the light faded, Clara told herself the same thing she had every night since leaving home. Keep your head down. Work hard and expect nothing. Yet somewhere deep inside her, beneath the loneliness, beneath the shame, something fragile began to stir. Something that almost felt like hope. The morning broke cold and gray, the kind of sky that pressed low over the land. Clara had been up before dawn, baking bread and boiling coffee, her hands moving on their own while her heart felt heavy and restless. She hadn't slept much. The house still whispered reminders of all that wasn't hers. Elias's late wife's linens, her handwriting on old recipe cards, her shadow in every quiet corner. Clara told herself it didn't matter. She wasn't here to belong. She was here to serve, to earn her keep, and nothing more. When breakfast ended and the men left for the day's work, she took a basket of linens to wash by the creek. The air was cool, the water biting at her fingers as she scrubbed. She didn't hear Elias's boots approach until his shadow fell across her. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "you'll freeze your hands clean off in that water." Clara jumped, nearly dropping the shirt she was washing. "Oh!" "I didn't hear you come up, Mr. Kane. I'm sorry. I was just trying to get these done before the rain comes." Elias crouched beside her, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "You always this hard on yourself?" She frowned, not knowing how to answer. "Work keeps my mind still," she murmured. He nodded, watching her for a moment. "Still minds are fine things, but not if they get lonely." His words struck her in a way she didn't expect. She looked down, ashamed, her bonnet slipping forward to hide her face. "I'm not the kind that draws company, sir." Something in her tone made him pause. He studied her hands, red from cold, her eyes fixed on the rippling water. There was no self-pity there, just quiet acceptance. That kind of honesty, he realized, was rarer than gold. Elias picked up a stone and skipped it across the creek. "You know," he said, "this land's got room for all kinds of souls. Don't matter if they're loud or quiet, pretty or plain. What matters is if they mean what they say." Clara looked up, startled by his gentleness. "Most folks don't think that way." He met her gaze. "Most folks talk too much." For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara laughed, a small, shy sound that broke through the chill air. It caught Elias by surprise and warmed something inside him he hadn't felt in a long time. From that day on, something subtle changed between them. Elias started taking his meals in the kitchen instead of alone at the big dining table. He asked her opinion about small things, how to season stew, which fabrics to order for the curtains, whether the hens needed new straw. She answered softly, always unsure, but he listened as though her words carried weight. The ranch hands noticed the change too. They teased Elias good-naturedly, saying the boss finally smiled more. He only shrugged it off. But later that evening, when Clara thanked him for fixing the loose hinge on her door, he said, "You work hard enough to earn a decent door. That's all there is to it." But she saw the faint blush under his sun-dark skin and wondered if there was more behind his words. One night, after everyone had turned in, Clara sat alone by the fire, mending a torn glove. Elias came in quietly, set a steaming cup of tea beside her, and said, "You shouldn't sit up alone, Miss Whitmore." "The nights get long out here," she smiled faintly. "I'm used to long nights." He looked at her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Maybe you shouldn't have to be." When he left, the warmth of his words lingered longer than the tea. Clara touched the rim of the cup and felt something strange stir in her chest, a soft, flickering light she hadn't dared feel in years. It wasn't love yet, not quite. But it was kindness, and it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, someone could see her for more than the face she hid. By early summer, the ranch was alive again. The fields were green, the cattle fattening, and the men worked with an ease that hadn't been seen since before Elias's loss. Clara's cooking filled the air with the scent of fresh bread and herbs. The porch, once silent at sundown, now hummed with laughter as she poured coffee for the hands and listened to their stories. Elias said little, but everyone noticed how his eyes softened when Clara was near. He'd begun to walk her to the well at dusk, a small lantern swinging between them. Their conversations were simple: weather, fences, recipes. But underneath ran something deeper, something fragile that neither dared name. Clara didn't fool herself into thinking he saw her that way. A man like Elias, she told herself, could never want a woman so plain, so easily overlooked. But his presence warmed her like sunlight through a window, distant but gentle. That peace shattered one bright morning when a carriage rattled down the lane, its wheels raising dust like a storm. From the window, Clara watched a woman step out, elegant, confident, her dress a shade of blue that shimmered against the plainness of the ranch yard. Ruth Harland. Even Clara had heard the name whispered in town. The daughter of a wealthy landowner, Ruth had spent the last 2 years back east, and rumor had it she'd once been sweet on Elias before he married his late wife. Elias Kane. Ruth called, her voice lilting and polished. "Are you truly still hiding yourself out here in the dust?" Elias came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Wasn't hiding," he said evenly. "Just working," she laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Always so serious. I thought perhaps I could tempt you with some company." Her eyes flicked to the house, and to Clara, who had stepped out onto the porch. "And who might this be?" Ruth asked, her painted smile tightening. Clara dropped her gaze and murmured, "Clara Whitmore, ma'am. I keep the kitchen." Ruth's eyes swept over her, slow and sharp. "Oh, the help." She turned back to Elias, pretending to whisper though her voice carried easily. "I see you've replaced your wife with someone practical, not decorative." The words hit like a slap. Clara felt the heat rise to her cheeks and wished she could disappear. Elias's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just tipped his hat and told Ruth she was welcome to stay for lunch. During the meal, Ruth talked endlessly, about the city, her gowns, the men who courted her. Every now and then she'd glance at Clara, a smirk curving her lips. When Elias complimented the biscuits, Ruth added sweetly, "They're fine, I suppose," though presentation could use a touch more grace. Clara smiled politely and excused herself, her chest aching. She cleaned the kitchen long after lunch ended, scrubbing the same plate until her hands trembled. She told herself it didn't matter, that she'd grown used to such remarks. But deep down, the familiar voice of shame whispered again, "You don't belong here." That evening, she overheard Ruth's laughter on the porch, light and musical. Elias's deep voice followed, calm and polite. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she imagined them easily enough. Talk of old times, of easier days. Her eyes stung as she packed her few belongings into her carpet bag. It wasn't his fault. He deserved someone like Ruth, someone polished and beautiful. who belonged to his world. As she tied her bonnet and looked one last time at the quiet kitchen she had come to love, she whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for letting me stay long enough to remember what kindness feels like." Then, before the moon had risen, Clara slipped out into the night, her footsteps soft on the earth, her heart breaking with every step away from the only home she'd ever known. But what she didn't know was that Elias Kane had already noticed the empty space where she should have been, and was about to go after her before the dawn broke. The sky was pale with the first hint of dawn when Elias found the note on the kitchen table, written in a trembling hand and folded neatly beside the cold coffee pot. "Mr. Kane, thank you for your kindness and the roof you've given me. I've realized this house and this life belong to people finer than me. I'll trouble you no longer. Clara Whitmore." Elias read it twice, his jaw tightening. Outside, the world was waking, the sound of roosters, the lowing of cattle, but inside him grew a storm fiercer than any wind. Without a word, he grabbed his coat, saddled his horse, and rode hard toward the east road. The morning air stung his face as he followed the narrow trail toward town. The sun rose behind him, flooding the land in gold, but all he could think about was that note, those words, heavy with shame and humility. He found her walking along the ridge, carpetbag clutched to her chest, bonnet pulled low against the wind. She looked small against the endless stretch of prairie, like a figure fading into the horizon. "Clara," he called, his voice echoing across the quiet land. She froze. For a moment, she seemed ready to run, but then she turned, slowly, her eyes wide with surprise and sorrow. "Mr. Kane," she began, but her voice broke. "You shouldn't have come." Elias swung down from his horse and closed the distance between them. "Shouldn't have come?" he said, his tone rough with emotion. "You think I'd just let you walk away?" Clara clutched her bag tighter. "I didn't belong there. Miss Harland was right. You need someone who can stand beside you, not someone who hides in the kitchen." He frowned. "You're leaving because of Ruth Harland?" She hesitated, her throat tightening. "Because of the truth? Because I'm not what a man like you should be seen with. I'm not pretty or graceful or—" "Stop." The word came out firm, cutting through the cold morning air. Elias stepped closer, his eyes steady on hers. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice low. "I don't care a lick for what's pretty. Beauty don't last. It fades with the sun and blows away with the dust. But honesty shines brighter than beauty ever could." Her lips parted, trembling. "You don't mean that." He took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the dust on his boots, the wear in his eyes. "I've buried a woman, Clara. I've watched what love looks like when it fades into memory. What I've learned is this: truth matters more than charm, and loyalty more than lace. You've given me more peace in these months than all the fine talk and perfume in the world." Tears welled in her eyes. She tried to look away, but he reached out gently, lifting her chin with his calloused hand. "You hide your face like it's something to be ashamed of," he whispered. "But I see more grace in your honesty than Ruth Harland'll ever have in her silken powder." Clara's breath hitched. "You shouldn't say such things." "Why not?" he said softly. "They're true." The prairie wind stirred between them, carrying the faint scent of sage and rain. Clara's heart pounded as she looked up at him. This man who saw her not as something plain, but as something real. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Say you'll come home." She hesitated, then nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Elias took her bag, tied it to the saddle, and helped her up onto the horse beside him. As they rode back toward Silver Creek, the sun climbed higher, lighting the world in gold. Clara's bonnet slipped back, the wind tugging at her hair, and for the first time in years, she didn't hide. Elias glanced at her, a small, knowing smile on his face. "See?" he said quietly. "Told you, Clara. Honest shines brighter." And this time, she believed him. The days that followed their return to Silver Creek felt gentler, as if the land itself had settled into peace. Clara moved through the house with a lighter step. Elias spoke more often now, not in grand speeches, but in quiet, steady words that made her heart flutter in ways she didn't quite understand. They fell into a rhythm, shared breakfasts, long evenings on the porch, and soft laughter over simple things. It wasn't courtship, not yet. It was something quieter, something that grew like roots beneath the soil. But life on the frontier never allowed peace for long. The summer skies began to darken one afternoon while Elias and his men were out mending a far fence line. Clara noticed it first from the kitchen window, a low churning mass of clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, whipping the clothes on the line until the pins snapped loose. By the time she ran outside, the first growl of thunder shook the air. "Elias," she whispered, staring out toward the distant hills. They were still out there, too far to reach before the storm broke. Rain came down hard and fast, slicing through the air. The men would need dry blankets and food if they were trapped out there. Without thinking, Clara packed bread, jerky, and a kettle into a saddlebag. She threw on Elias's spare coat, it hung heavy and broad on her shoulders, and saddled the old bay mare. The ranch hand in the barn shouted after her, "Miss Whitmore." "You can't ride out in that storm," but she was already gone, pushing the horse forward into sheets of blinding rain. The prairie became a blur of gray and motion. Water ran in streams across the path, and thunder cracked so close it made the earth tremble. Clara bent low over the saddle, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. At last she saw them, dark, figures through the curtain of rain, wrestling with broken fencing and panicked cattle. "Elias!" she cried. He turned, disbelief flashing across his face before he ran toward her. "Clara, what in blazes are you doing out here?" "You needed supplies," she shouted back, voice trembling. "The men—" A bolt of lightning struck a nearby tree, splitting it with a deafening crack. The horse reared, nearly throwing her. Elias caught the bridle just in time, pulling her close. Rain drenched them both, running in rivulets down their faces. "You could have been killed," he said, breathless. "You shouldn't have come." Clara's voice shook, but her gaze didn't waver. "I couldn't just sit there while you were out here fighting this alone." Something in her tone stopped him. There it was again. That quiet strength, the kind he'd only ever seen in the rarest of souls. He took her hand and shouted to the men, "Get the herd to the ridge, the creek's rising." They worked side by side through the storm, mud sucking at their boots, rain stinging their faces. Clara's skirts were heavy with water, her arms trembling from exhaustion, but she never quit. When a frightened calf got caught in the flooded gully, she waded in without hesitation. Elias cursed under his breath and went after her, grabbing her around the waist and hauling her back just as the current surged. They fell together in the mud, gasping, hearts pounding. "Reckless woman," he muttered, brushing wet hair from her face. "Honest woman," she corrected softly, her lips trembling in a tired smile. He stared at her for a long moment, rain running down his cheek, mixing with something that wasn't rain at all. When the storm finally passed, the men cheered from the ridge. They'd saved most of the herd. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and lightning. Elias helped Clara onto his horse, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "You're soaked through," he said gruffly. "You'll catch your death." She smiled faintly. "You'd have done the same for me." He didn't argue, just held her a little closer as they rode back home through the silver mist of dawn. In the quiet that followed, he realized what the storm had made clear. He could lose cattle, fences, even a roof. But not her. Never her. The morning after the storm, Silver Creek Ranch looked like it had survived a war. Fences were down, the barn roof half torn, and the ground a mess of mud and broken branches. But the air was fresh and sharp, washed clean by the rain, and the sky stretched wide and blue once more. Inside the ranch house, the fire crackled softly. Clara woke, wrapped in a wool blanket near the hearth, the faint smell of smoke and coffee drifting through the room. Her head ached, her arms sore, but she was alive. Elias sat nearby, half slumped in a chair, his hat tipped forward, watching the fire. When she stirred, he straightened immediately. "Easy now," he said gently. "You hit your head on a fence post last night when that calf nearly pulled you under." Clara blinked at him, her voice hoarse. "Did we save it?" He smiled faintly. We saved more than the calf, Clara. She looked down at her mud-stained hands, her cheeks warming. I'm sorry, Mr. Kane. I shouldn't have gone out there. I didn't mean to worry you. He shook his head. You didn't worry me. He paused, then added quietly, You scared me half to death. Clara's heart gave a small, startled flutter. The firelight danced over his face, tired, lined, but kind. She wanted to say something, anything, but words tangled in her throat. You shouldn't have risked yourself like that, he said, rising and pacing to the window. A woman like you deserves better than nearly drowning in mud for a herd of cows. She smiled faintly. You would have done the same, he turned, meeting her gaze. Yes, he admitted, but I've got less to lose. Clara frowned, confused. Less to lose? Elias took a slow breath and crossed the room, his boots soft against the worn floorboards. You've got something I don't, Clara. You've got heart. You care even when it costs you. Her eyes widened as he stopped in front of her, his voice quiet but unshakable. I've seen women dressed finer, prettier, fancier, but I've never seen one ride through a storm for someone else's sake. Clara swallowed hard, unable to hold his gaze for long. You're making too much of it. Not near enough, he said. The silence between them thickened, filled with things neither dared speak. The crackle of the fire, the drip of rain from the eaves, it all seemed to fade until there was only the sound of their breathing. Finally, Elias sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his arm. When I first hired you, I thought you were just another soul trying to outrun something. But you've done more for this place than any hired man ever could. You brought life back to it, and to me. Her throat tightened. Elias, please don't. He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing against hers. I mean every word. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't understand. I've been told all my life I'm not enough. Not pretty, not worthy. He lifted her chin, gently but firmly. Then they were blind. Clara blinked, startled by the conviction in his voice. Pretty fades, Elias said softly, but honest lasts. And you, Clara Whitmore, you're the truest thing I've ever known. Her tears fell freely then. One hand pressed to her lips to stifle a sob. Elias hesitated for only a heartbeat before pulling her into his arms. She fit there perfectly, as if she'd been meant to all along. The storm outside had passed, but inside that quiet ranch house, another kind of storm settled, warm, steady, and unspoken. For a long while they stayed like that, the fire glowing beside them, neither needing to say another word. When she finally looked up, her voice was barely a whisper. What happens now? Elias smiled, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. Now, he said, we start mending what's broken, together. Outside, the land glistened with dew and the promise of a new morning. The sun rose slowly over Silver Creek Ranch, spilling gold across the hills and broken fences. The world felt washed clean, as though the storm had carried away more than just dirt. It had lifted the heavy shadows that had lingered over the ranch for far too long. Clara stood on the porch that morning, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The air was cool and alive with birdsong. Below her, Elias worked to repair a fallen section of the fence. His sleeves rolled to his elbows, the morning light catching in his hair. For a long moment, she simply watched him, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. She had once believed her life would be nothing but a series of struggles, always proving, always surviving. Yet here, in this quiet valley with this kind, steady man, she had found something she never expected. Peace. Elias noticed her watching and tipped his hat with a grin. If you're done staring, Miss Whitmore, I could use a hand. She laughed, the sound soft and warm. You'd think after all that you'd let a woman rest. Rest, he teased. We've got a whole ranch to put back together. Clara walked down to meet him, her skirts brushing through the dew-laden grass. Together they lifted the fallen posts and reset the rails. Every movement was quiet teamwork, the rhythm easy, familiar. Once she had feared she would never belong anywhere. Now she realized belonging wasn't about being invited. It was about being seen, truly seen. And Elias Kane had seen her from the start. By noon the work was nearly done. They sat beneath a cottonwood tree sharing bread and coffee. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of wild sage and sun-warmed earth. I've been thinking, Elias said after a while, his tone calm but serious. "This ranch feels different with you here." "Feels alive again." Clara looked at him, her pulse quickening. "You've made it alive again. You gave me a chance when no one else would." He shook his head. "You gave me a reason to keep going." They sat in silence for a moment. The quiet stretched between them, full but comfortable. Then, without the hesitation of the man he once was, Elias turned to her. "Clara, I don't have much to offer. No fancy things, no promises beyond hard work and honest days. But if you'll stay, I'd like to build this place with you. Together." Her breath caught, eyes glistening. She didn't need a ring of gold or grand words. She needed this, the steady truth of him. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I've never wanted fancy. I just want a place to stand, and someone who sees me." He reached for her hand, rough and warm. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay, and let's see what we can make of this life." Clara smiled through her tears. "You already make it beautiful." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in hues of fire and honey, they walked the ridge above the ranch together. The fences stood mended, the cattle grazed peacefully, and the air smelled of promise. Elias stopped and turned to her, brushing a stray hair from her face. "You remember what I said that night?" She nodded softly. "That honesty shines brighter than beauty." He smiled, his voice rough with feeling. "Still true. But I was wrong about one thing." "Oh?" she asked, brow raised. "You shine brighter than both." Clara laughed, tears shimmering like sunlight. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. The world stretched wide and endless around them, quiet, open, full of second chances. And as the stars began to pierce the sky above Silver Creek Ranch, Clara finally understood. The love that lasts isn't found in grand gestures or perfect faces. It's built, slowly and honestly, by two souls brave enough to see each other fully. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying her soft reply into the fading day. "I'll stay." And Elias, the cowboy who'd once thought himself too broken for love, smiled against the starlight. "Then I reckon we've both come home."